Okay, everyone, then I think the time has come to just start the talk and not start the talk, that would be way too premature, but to start the event with me talking some more. I posted a link onto our chat inside Zoom to show you one of the ways we can interact with each other throughout the way. But let me quickly go to the slides. So as you could tell right now, we are doing this one remotely, right? So we are not meeting in the cbase, and we all know why. This talk and everything beforehand is recorded. If you feel uncomfortable with this one, just let me know, and I can find a way to either remove you or not share the video recording afterwards. This new situation is, like I said, all new to us. So we'll just see how this works out and hopefully learn something on the go. For the one talk we have today, we have prepared Q&A sessions. And I just muted all, I hope. And the Q&A sessions will be held after the talk. So this means if you have something you want to be asked after the talk, please go forward to go to the Slido page. That also has a beautiful QR code on the next slide I just showed. So if you have questions for after the talk, please use the hashtag Q&A inside the Slido questionnaire, or I don't know, tool for asking questions. Also afterwards, we've planned of separating the discussions some more. So if you would have if you want to talk about one specific topic, feel free to use the hashtag topics or topic inside the Slido event so that we can then separate into separate rooms after the talk. Yes. So the one talk I keep mentioning is the one from Florian today. He will be taking over someone else's code base. I'm very excited to hear about this one, not just because I had to do the same thing recently, but it's also quite an interesting topic in general. After this talk, we obviously have the question and answer section, and then we'll also break out in separate rooms. But despite of this one, what else can you do with Android in Berlin at the specific times today? Like always, we keep having our Android co-learning. This co-learning will also be happening remote. So please, if you want to join our Slack channel and then go there for #co-learning, where we will propose how we will do the co-learning specifically. If you haven't joined yet our Slack channel, please feel free to use the URL slack.berlindroid.de or scan the QR code now. I will leave the slide open for another 3.5 seconds. So quickly checking something over here, and everything seems good. If you didn't have the chance of scanning the QR code, just remember slack.berlindroid.de or our general hub page, berlindroid.de. You will find the Slack links there. Also, if you feel like you want to be like Florian and join our community of speakers, feel free to use talk.berlindroid.de or yet another QR code in the background where you can submit your talk with some specific fields. We are always asking all the speakers, and at some point we will come back to you and tell you what we think and when we can file you into our meetup situation. So when your talk will be happening. And with that, we are now coming forward to the next meetup. The next meetup will be, the next monthly meetup will be on April 29th this year, I hope. And how we meet, we don't know yet. Maybe like this again, or maybe in person, but probably remotely again. And with that one, let me hand over the mic and the sharing to Florian, and let's have him his talk. Florian, are you available?
Yeah. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you wonderfully.
Okay, cool, awesome. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can present or if it's going to, well, I guess it's good enough like this as well. If I can go back and forth. No, I can't. Oh, okay. I don't know if, can you still see something? Mario?
Please try again. I just made you a co-host. You should be able to,
Okay.
or I made another Florian co-host.
Okay.
I can see your screen now.
Yeah, it's good. Is the presentation? Okay, cool, awesome. Yeah. So welcome everyone. I hope everyone is comfortable at home. Yeah, so my presentation is about taking over someone else's code base. So it's something I had to do quite a bit in my last years. I used to work for an agency for 4 years. So it's something I was doing at least on every 6 months, sometime even less. So I have quite a bit of experience with this. Wanted to share this with you all, and yeah, that's about it. How do I go next? Here we go. Okay, so yeah, my name is Florian. I used to work at an agency before. Probably quite some of you know it already, Novoda. I worked there for 4 years. I had the chance of working on a lot of different projects in a lot of different domains with a lot of different team setup. I switched job quite recently at the beginning of the year. Now working for Trade Republic. Not sure if some of you know about it, but it's one of those fintech. We are of course hiring, and yeah, based in Berlin, Germany, like most of you, I guess. So yeah, Trade Republic is, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's an app where you can buy stocks, basically. It's the Europe's first commission-free mobile broker. It's easy, fast, convenient access to capital markets for everyone. And yeah, make stock trading that simple, commission-free. Yeah, that's about it. It's a really interesting app. It's really interesting to work on that because there's a lot of really interesting challenge, especially considering like real time and all that stuff, but that's probably for another talk. So what's this talk about? So I usually have, I used to, at least at the beginning, have quite some frustration when I need to take over a code base, be it because, well, I feel like the code is not in a good state, or gets frustrated because I don't really understand anything, or I need to be right away ready to smash some code, write new features. So I want to talk about a bit how I try and avoid this frustration. I want to talk a bit also about strategies to take over the code base, what you can do to achieve that, and finally also how to leave a code base, right? Because we usually get into a code base and then at some point, well, you leave, right? So how can you make it better, and how can you leave it better than what you found? So the first bit I want to talk about, and I think that's one of the most important aspects, if not the most important, I think it's really important to come into this kind of task of taking over a code base with a really good mindset. When I talk about mindset, I mean not being like, oh, this is going to be a pile of, you know what, this is going to be awful, and it's Java. It's, yeah. So I think it's important to start with a good mindset. I usually try to take everything as a challenge, instead of being like, oh, this is going to be so bad. I'm going to be like, oh, this is going to be a good challenge or a good opportunity to, to refactor, to learn about a new domain, this kind of things. I looked a bit on the web and collected a bunch of quotes regarding this topic, and I found a bunch of quotes that are quite interesting, I find. So this one is from Hacker News. So my first rule for existing code bases, just because you wouldn't have done it that way, done it the way they did, doesn't mean they did it wrong. As in, whatever code base you're going to take over is going to have something that you find weird or something that you find bad. But in the end, it usually works. So that's what you want, right? So you probably would have done different way, but if it works, then it does work. Yeah, this one is the one I was talking about. I think it's developer nature to look at a huge pile of code that someone else wrote and immediately think this is a pile of crap. I can do better. So the first thing to do is rewrite all of this my way, which just so happens to be the right way. I find this kind of quite interesting because I feel like it's something I was thinking quite a bit about when I was really junior. I used to always look at code and be like, oh, this is so bad, I could do so much better. So I think it's also something to keep in mind. And also to realize that after 3 years, so if the code base is there for 3 years, they have hopefully fixed a lot of bugs and got to a solution that is somewhat mature and better than what you can do in a week, which is usually true. Yeah, another quote, that's a bit too much. Yeah, and I found this comic also like a few weeks ago, which is usually quite interesting because it's usually, I mean, hopefully not always, but it does happen sometime that you just end up on the code base and the original developer just gone the same day, and you're like, well, I need to do it now. Yeah, so this is the mindset. I think it's really important to go into this new task with a good mindset. This is going to be interesting. This is going to refactor quite a bit of code, going to learn about new domains. And then of course there's different kinds of taking over. So at Novoda, I usually was taking over not alone. I usually was taking over with either the team was still present, or I would take over with a team from Novoda. And usually, hopefully, you have someone when you start taking over that is either there for a long time or there for at least a little time, so you can ask questions and try to understand the most important part of the app. What I usually start by doing when I inherit a code base, so of course pulling the code, but I usually first look if there is some crash reporting. Yes, I took over some apps where there was no crash reporting. If there is one, it's interesting to have a look at the crashes. If they are high, if they are low. Be careful. That happens also to me a few times, that sometimes the app would have like literally zero crashes. That might be also a red flag, because it might mean that exception has just like try catched everywhere, and so the app is actually not really working but not crashing. Zero, so 100% crash free, which is yeah, and not great. So that's why I usually go also after that. I look at the app reviews. Are the reviews good, bad? If they are bad, is it because of the product itself, which is, well, not great, but it's not concerning directly the code base? Or is it because, well, stuff is crashing, stuff doesn't work, and this kind of thing? So it gives you also a good idea of the health of the code base. I usually also play quite a bit with the app, check a bit the performance. Is it like super slow, or is it like smooth? Also good indicator. Yeah, look quickly at the history of the code. I always find it interesting to see when was the first commit. Is it an app that is a year old? Is it an app that is 10 years old? How many collaborators were on this code base? How big it looks. Also tend to look at the structure of the app. So is it a monolith? Is it modularized? I feel like when it's modularized, it's a bit easier to navigate into the app. but we'll go back to this later. I also tend to look at the code classes, which on Android, unfortunately, most of the time, the base classes, this infamous base fragment, base activity, that are usually a way to dump all the framework related stuff. Like, I don't know, I saw like kind of inheritance kind of chain going through the roof, or like a fragment inheriting a base permission fragment, inheriting a base list fragment, inheriting. So I find it always interesting to see if there's this kind of issues, because it's usually a good first point to start in refactoring and extracting collaborator from those base classes. Also look at the architecture. I usually don't pay much attention in which architecture is used, but I more pay attention if there's a kind of architecture or pattern that is used throughout the app. It makes it easier than when we need to do big changes, if everything is actually the same. Looking at tests as well. Is there unit test, is there UI test? What's the code coverage? The CI setup as well. Sometimes there's no CI setup at all. What is run, when, how much time does it take? Yeah, so basic stuff, I would say. I always have like, so I'm not really like a paper and pen kind of guy. So I usually use Keep, but I write down every goddamn question I have while going through the code base, because I always can then ask this question back whenever I can get hold on someone that has a clue. Quickly look if there is some dev tools, custom dev tools that's been made for the app to make the life easier. Also interesting to look at the external actors. Is the app just local? Does it use a REST API? Is it owned by us? Is it owned by another company? Do we have a database? All that stuff is also interesting, because then it tells you what are the points of failures. Yeah, basic security. Is the app even pro-guarded, for instance? Depending on how critical security is, certificate pinning as well might be one. Deployment process. This is a big one. I mean, not really a big one, but it's something that bites me quite a bit throughout the year. I always forget about this, and then when it's time to release, you just like realize that you don't have the right keys, or that nothing is automated, so you still need to build on your machine, upload to a console where you also don't have the credentials. So it's also interesting to see if there is zero setup or if it's fully automated. At Trade Republic recently, we fully automated everything, which makes it really easy to just deploy by clicking on a button, and it's already on the Play Store and ready to be released. So it's pretty neat. Also interesting to have a high-level overview of the dependencies. Are we using 10 different image loader libraries? Are we using the usual OKHTTP retrofit stack? Maybe looking also a bit at the dependency injection, which is also usually a problem because no one really know how to use Dagger. I don't say this as a bad thing. I say this as a general thing. It's pretty confusing. So it's usually also a pretty big mess in the Dagger modules. So it's also keeping an eye on that. And yeah, one of the really important thing I find is that you really need to make use of the code base owner. If someone is on site, even for a couple of weeks, and has a clue about the code base, you need to use that person. You need to ask him, her, all the goddamn question you have, because once this person is gone, it's gone. And you really need to understand the whole system. At the beginning, it doesn't really matter. You need to have like a good vision of like, okay, you don't need to go in details, but then you really need to know about the non-obvious or the tricky part of the system. It's not something that is always super obvious, but it's something you usually find after looking at the code for a while. My recommendation is also just to ask the developer, like, do you have any idea of what are some part of the app that are really tricky and not obvious or fully hacky, and they can get me through it? yeah, that's usually what I do. Try to focus also on the history of the code base. Why are things the way they are? Because usually the history and the context are really hard to deduce from the code of the documentation, because sometimes there's no documentation, or sometimes the code is not in a good shape. And if you, after 2 months being on a project, if you start to realize, oh, actually, we don't need to have this huge database that is driving the whole app, I don't understand why it's here. Then yeah, it's a pretty bad situation. So it's called I learned this. It's called the Chesterton's fence principle. Partly there was like a fence in the middle of nowhere, and someone wanted to remove it because like it had no use. And I think someone told him, "I'm going to remove this fence the day you come up with me. You come up to me with the reason why the fence is here, and then we can decide, does this still make sense or not?" And I feel like it's the same with programming as well. You have this thing there, you want to remove them, but you don't really understand why they are there in the first place. So it's better to understand why they are there in the first place, and then take a decision. Okay, maybe 3 years ago it did make sense, but now it doesn't make sense because we could just use this instead or do that instead. But always come up with a reason why you would need to do such a big change in the code base. Yeah, this one is a big one as well. It's one as well. It's sometimes a bit hard, and you sometimes also don't really realize. But I think it's really important to put yourself in the seat of the original developer or the original team that developed the application, and to have some empathy. It's pretty much always in the way you say things. So when you ask about what's something doing, try to have a good tone and to be genuinely interested. So instead of being like, okay, what is this piece of, or what is this thing even doing? Just saying this, or what is this even doing? When you actually talk to the person who probably wrote this piece of code, it's not a good way, because the other person is going to be on the defensive, try to defend themselves whether they had to do this. And it's just not a good start for a conversation. So maybe a better way to go is to ask in a nicer way. So could you guide me through this? And I think we can all be understandable in this sense that we all been to time, what's called crunch time, and had to take shortcuts and be like, yeah, it's fine. Once the crunch time is passed, I can just go back to it and make it better. Either the crunch time never pass and you're always in crunch time, or you just forget about it and you never got to revisit this piece of code. And 3 years later, it's still there. It grew more and it's a big part of the app. And now you also need to explain it to the next person who's going to take ownership of the code base. So yeah, having an impact. So I have a couple of do and do not, at least when you start taking ownership of this code base. It's a very bad idea to start a huge refactoring from the get-go. I don't know, like a huge, okay, let's modularize the app now. It's a monolith, let's modularize it so we can compile faster, and let's just do it after 1 week on the project. I actually have an anecdote from, I joined, a couple of years ago, I joined a project where it was a big team of Android developers who took the code base from another agency. And the team had no clue about the code base. And the very first decision they took is, this is a huge monolith, we need to make it, we need to modularize it. We need to have feature modules, it's going to be better, it's going to be clearer, let's just do it. And the app was huge, like 100 different screens. I don't know how many different flows. The domain was also huge. It was impossible like to really know exactly everything that the app was doing. There was no crash reporting. So we didn't even know how the app was doing in the wild. And the first decision they took was like, okay, we need to modularize the app, put everything in modules, and they did it. The problem is it took like months And then once this was done, then they realized that the app was broken everywhere. So, and of course, like that's when I joined. We needed to add features, to fix bugs, and no one really knew all the app, all the flows, all the screens. The app was crashing constantly, mostly because of the Dagger setup as well. So everything was just impossible. It took us a month to make it back to something stable. And in the end, we just spent 6 months, like just modularizing an app and make it back to stable. And I don't think we even really gain anything. We just lost 6 months. So yeah, hold off the huge refactoring and maybe plan them when you really have a good understanding of the domain and the code and what this means. So yeah, do not also start writing new code right away. I think that's a better way to explain later. Do not also introduce breaking changes. So all of this is kind of the same thing, right? And also, yeah, this one is a big one as well. Do not play the blame game, also get you only so far. And it's really easy to be like, oh, I don't know, blaming the original developer. It's like, oh, the code is so bad, I cannot do anything. No. Because in the end, well, that's your job, right? So you need to fix bugs, you need to add features, and you can blame all you want. In the end, you still need to do it, right? What do we have next? Yeah, this is an important one. Understand the purpose of the system, what this user want from it, and how they use it to achieve that. So that's basically just played with the app and understand what people get from it. Learn about processes. So learn about what's used for what kind of the general processes regarding the app. It's always interesting to see also how people interact and all that. Get to know the architecture. So go through the app, look if everything is, it's already a really big point if everything is kind of always done the same, even if it's done in a kind of like awkward way, but at least if everything is the same, then you can start changing something somewhere and then just apply this the same way everywhere, which is quite neat. Then yeah, if everything again is in activities and fragments, this happens quite a bit, hopefully not as much as back in the first days of Android, where there was not really any focus from Google on how to architect an app, but this is something still I've seen quite a bit, and it's never fun to open activities that are 5,000 lines long. I usually start with little task on a new app that I get to know. I usually start with little tasks that involve just new code, old code that needs to be changed. Because then I don't have to start and writing new code in a code base I don't know at all, because then I have this mindset of how I feel code should be written, and I don't really have the mindset of how the code should be written for this app. So it's usually pretty neat to start working on little tasks that involved code that already exists. Then on the same vein, there's small refactoring task or small bugs fixing, getting familiar with the language of the domain. So in my years in agency, I learned about so many domains, so various as well. I learned about TV streaming, I learned about baking, I learned about cars, I learned about what else? Music streaming, and now I learn about finance. And I think it's really important to get familiar with the language of the domain, because if you don't, then it's also easy to get lost in the code base and have no clue what the screens are even doing. So it really helps. Another one, I think I even put this one more for me, but asking for help is a really big one. I tend to struggle a bit with that. But really, if you're blocked, just ask someone. Reading the wiki and the documentation, I find it really interesting, even though usually it's either doesn't exist or it's really outdated. But when it's outdated, it's also quite interesting because then usually you have some insight into really old decision that's been made. So I feel like even if most of it is outdated, it's still worth reading it. And if when you read it, you feel like there's things that are missing, then it's also a good thing to just take notes on this and fill the gaps later. I feel it's really important to take your time as well, not to rush into a new code base, otherwise you can really break a lot of things without really realizing it. So take your time. On the other end of, I was talking earlier about the blame game. So there's a big difference between blaming the original people who wrote the code base and communicating your concerns. So I think it's totally legit to communicate those when you are asked to perform this task or this task, and be like, okay, I had a look at the code base. The code base is in state X or Y, and I'm a bit concerned that it's going to take me a bit more time, and probably I would have to refactor this and this and this. And so I think it's totally legit to communicate your concerns also, like being like, okay, this, I'm pretty sure I might broke stuff. And then at least if this happens, then it's something you communicated and it's fine. Yeah, taking notes, finding the right level of detail. At the beginning, it's no use really to go through the tiniest detail. Doesn't really matter how the parsing of the JSON work at the beginning, for instance. But it's interesting to find some of the different flows. Like the more you get to know the code base, and the more you get on refactoring task, and the more you get into this level of detail. But it's no use to go right away really deep. This one is also an interesting one, because at some point you're going to have to write new code, right? So if you're alone, or even if you're in a team, especially if you're in a team actually, it's a good idea to create or find a good candidate for a blueprint. As in, soon enough, you're going to have to write like an entire feature. And it's a good idea beforehand to agree with your teammates or with yourself, if you're alone on the code base, how you go in writing your features, which kind of architecture do you use. So either you just create one from scratch, and then on our project, what we did is we refactored a feature, for instance, or we created a new one, and then we put it as a PR, and then we have people commenting on it. And then you can have discussions, and you can agree on as well how to move forward. It makes it also really easy because you also avoid all of these torrents of comments on new PRs, where you have all these different people that have different idea of how code should be written. And then if you agree before on the blueprint, then you can say, well, that's what we agreed on, right? And then, of course, you can always see how it goes, and then of course iterate if there's a thing that needs to be changed. I find using the debugger as well in the worst code base to be the most effective method, to have a clue a bit how the flow goes. It happened to me a few times that I really had to, because it was just event bus everywhere, and it was really, really hard to understand what was going on. Another nice thing to do as well is to ask for a time budget on refactoring. If the code base is in a state that you think is not the greatest, it's a good idea to ask for that. And about 20% of the sprint you spend it on refactoring task that you already have, right? Because you took all these notes. And then of course it's a good idea also to share the wins, to show that this has a positive impact, right? So I don't know, the test coverage is up, for instance, there's less dependencies, the app is smaller, you feel more confident in making the changes, the app is more stable, less crashes, all that stuff. Focus on the worst part, the rest can always wait. Like if it's not broken, just don't have to fix it now. Just focus really. If you find like something that is really dangerous or really bad, then focus on that, and then the rest can always wait. Always something that needs to be addressed. The code base is never going to be fully migrated. That's a dream that never happens. Expect to write quite some glue between the old code base and the legacy code base and the new code you write. And in general, what I tend to do is when I extract, when I come and I see a piece of code I don't have much clue what it's doing and I need to modify it because of a task I have, I usually start to test it. So then I'm more confident. So then first I understand better what this is actually doing, and then I'm way more confident into refactoring it because I can just use the test as a safety net, and then you just repeat it. Works quite well with every piece of code that is business logic. Yeah, in terms of Android specifics, because all of that had nothing to do with Android specifically. But yeah, I also usually look at what is nowadays considered deprecated and or dangerous. But still happens that you come up with code bases that still use async task, for instance, or that post delayed stuff, and so it leaks all kind of activities or fragment or context or whatever. Find it also interesting to go through the deprecated warnings and see if some of them are interesting to fix. Yeah, this one is probably a bit smaller, but happens also especially in the last few years with the introduction of live data, view models, and whatnot, coroutines now as well, that you arrive in some code base that just has like a weird mix of all of that, and it's a bit hard then to navigate, and sometimes it's just some experiment here and there, and it's better to just like remove it for the sake of consistency. And also having a look at the state of modularization. Is there a monolith? Might be fine actually if it's a small app. Or is it already modularized? In what way is it modularized? Is it modularized by feature, which I think is pretty much the norm nowadays? Or I had some code base also that were kind of modularized into layers, which is a bit more tricky, I find. So I mean like architecture layers. So you have like a presentation layer, data layer, which I find a bit hard to use. And also it means that whenever you work on a feature, then it just recompile the whole app because you need to touch on the layers. So it might be also interesting to try and pull those things out into feature modules. And yeah, incremental changes. So extracting collaborator from base or code classes. So whenever I end up in a code base, I always find this base fragment that do permissions, navigation, that do also tracking. And it's always like a good idea to try and extract collaborators from those that then you can use only in the fragments or the activities you need, instead of this code being shared everywhere. And then it's this huge pile of code in the base class, which makes it really hard to change. So yeah, the composition over inheritance, unfortunately, that's how the framework is built as well. This is something that is a bit changing with the component activity. I think I'm going to talk about this a bit later. I also try to make use of these activity callbacks that you can register in the application, because then you can also remove quite a bit of code from this base activity where oh, someone's drawing something. Interesting. Yeah, modularization, I find it quite easy to start by, instead of arriving on the code base and being like, okay, I need to modularize, I need to just modularize whatever exists first. I find it quite easy to just, whenever you start a new feature, and this feature is worthy to have its own module, of course, but to just start like this and have a module for this new feature. And then you can also see how it interacts with the other modules and how much things you need to pull out from other modules. So it's a really interesting experiment. experimentation, and it's also paved the way for modularizing the rest of the application when you have more of an idea of how that would work. Usually it's also Android and iOS, right? Usually you have the Android team, the iOS team. And I also find it interesting to synchronize with the iOS team. I usually peek into the iOS PRs and see what's the process there, how do they work. And it might be also interesting to have a discussion and try to synchronize a bit with the iOS pips. Yeah, this is more text. Yeah, I find it interesting also, like when you start using the app and working, there's always this kind of annoying thing that you need to repeat 10 times, 20 times, 30 times a day. So for instance, at Trade Republic, one of the things was always because it's a banking app, right? So you always have to type your PIN. So one of the things that I introduced was like on dev mode, you have something that just type your PIN for you for the test account, which it doesn't sound like much, but it saves you typing your PIN 50 times a day. Pre-commit hooks, yeah, I like to have the ticket number in the commits, so it's easy to see what the commits are linked to. Reducing the execution time. This is an interesting one. So this happened in a few projects I've been on, especially Eric's Java based, when people don't really override the schedulers, and you end up having tests that takes like seconds to run because there's a delay on it or something. So it might be interesting. It happened to me a few times that I like just went from tests that in general would take 5 minutes, and then after changes would take a couple of seconds. And yeah, and the component activity. So this I'm like really excited about it. I don't know if you guys know about it, but it's basically, I think now it's part of Android X, and it's Google response to composition over inheritance with the whole activity. So they start to like break components out of the activity. So you can also stop having all this stuff in base activity and really modularized. I mean, extract logic from your activity and have it in nicely nice little collaborators that are not tied to the framework. So there's this one that you probably all know, the lifecycle observer. So you can get notified whenever the lifecycle change and then react accordingly. And then they introduced recently as well the on-back press dispatcher, which is really nice. So you finally don't have to do all these hacks, especially if you're in fragments to try and override the back press behavior. So you can just like kind of in the activity or in the fragments, you can like register this back press dispatcher, which is quite nice. And then you can just execute logic. You know, this whole like, we always need to do this at some point or another in the app where you want to press back and pops up this dialog. Are you sure you want to save your progress? Blah, blah, blah. So this is a really nice solution. And recently I was looking at this for this presentation actually, but unfortunately it's only in the alpha version for now. But they introduced also the activity result caller, which should make it way easier to deal with the whole starting activity for result and getting back the result and executing something. Yeah, they also introduced, now you have this require X. So you have this require context, require activity, require fragments, require fragment manager, maybe even require view. There's a bunch of them. There's require arguments as well for fragments, which is really neat because you can, in Kotlin, it's really easy to just type whatever is the third example, which is activity, and then the nullability operator, and then navigate to something, whatever. It's an extension function in this case. And yeah, the bad thing with this is you don't, because it's a one-liner, you don't really realize that you do a null check on it. And that if the activity is null for whatever reason, then this is never executed. And so you might have leaks in your app where this is never executed because, well, the activity at this point is null, even though it shouldn't be. So it's a really nice way to ensure. So require activity will actually crash the app if the activity is null, and then you just get this crash and you can fix it. So that's brilliant. Just yeah, we arrived to the end. So the Scott rule, right? The famous Boy Scouting. You know, when you're a kid and you go to the Boy Scout and you set up your camp, and then in the end of the camp you clean everything and you leave it better than what you found it. So it's the same principle for code bases, right? So it's time to give back so the next person have less of a hard time taking over. So when you take a code base, try to make it nicer. Try always to think how you can make it better so the next one can really hit the ground running. Be it documentation, for instance. Try to have clear commits, please. I look at this code base sometime and I have commits like the great bug hunt #2. And it's like a commit with 2,000 changes, and I'm like, okay, great, thank you. So please, clear commit messages goes a long way. If you do obscure hacks, and there's always obscure hacks with Android, it's always nice to leave a little link or a little comment explaining why you needed to do this, instead of having people wondering for hours why we need to do like this weird thing because it seems to work, but then if you end up in this scenario when you rotate the screen 3 times and then you scroll and then this happens. So yeah, always nice. And yeah, use your note and yeah, fill the gaps, write documentation if documentation need to be written, all that good stuff. Yeah, in Zusammenfassung, taking over is always a hell of a challenge. In a good way. I honestly now really prefer, I find refactoring way more interesting than actually writing new code. Do not approach this as a chore, it's really interesting. Yeah, do not rewrite the entire code base, at least at the beginning. Do take your time and do make it your own with little incremental changes. And please leave it as clean as possible for the next one. That's it.
Yay, thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. I really enjoyed the part about like how the team can also agree on something that's called, sorry, writing documentation, right? And the other one about component activity is also something nice. Thanks. So I was hoping that on this video page, we would have some questions we could answer now. This feels like, except for the praises in your chat, please read them through and appreciate them accordingly. Maybe we can start opening the round and just saying like, hey, if you have a question, feel free to either post it onto this video or just ask them directly here.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can also just talk about, I don't know if anyone has, because I bet most of the people here are actually currently working on code base that they inherited from someone else. So if anyone is struggling with something specific, be it code, or it might be also like sometimes it's a bit hard to communicate also with people. But I don't know if it's.
Yeah, then I'll just keep talking till somebody else joins in. So for me, being part of the team that is currently changing again, it was very interesting to see what did the others think about it before, right? So like, why is this there and how do we change it? Plus currently we are also working on a way that we define what we did, why, so that like the next time or somebody else is there, that we know why it is there. So we're using a similar approach as you did mention briefly, which is like ADRs, architecture definition records, which is like just a markdown file in your code base where you define like, okay, this is what we did, this is why we did it, and this is how you could do it too. Plus, additionally, what we are currently using is like also we're using it for code style. So like, why do we want to have new lines in this case? Or how do we put some constants somewhere? This is very interesting to have it written in prose, except for having it also where you can have it in like some code style guides, like just some lint rules or some detect rules to like break the build whenever somebody's yeah, breaking the rules so that we see that it was broken.
I'd like to add to that as well, is that so we do something quite similar in our team. Like we have a guild meeting every 2 weeks, where any time we want to sort of propose a change, introduce a new library, do a migration, even if it's something as simple as I think we should have new lines after we make a class declaration. Then we have a discussion about it, and then we decide, okay, this is what we do, and then that gets documented in the MD file in the repository, saying this is what we do. This is an example of good behavior. This is an example of naughty behavior, and you know that then it's nice to see like there's an actual history to it. You can see when it happened. You can see who committed it. You can see why they committed it. It's usually relating to a ticket that where you can link it to the discussion, and in some cases, you can actually reference it in the pull request you're making. So you can actually see there's a history to it. It's really quite nice. Also, great talk, thanks. I felt it's kind of like a description on how not to be a dick.
That's also a nice summary. Hi, Anna.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So let's assume we are taking over a code base that has no reporting in Firebase. Are there some, how would you start like adding Crashlytics and analytics?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, so it happens to me a few times, which I was really surprised about actually, because nowadays having an app that is on the Play Store and doesn't have any kind of crash reporting is pretty serious, I mean, I find. So I would say just add the crash reporting right away, publish a new version with new features on it, because it's really important to know how the app is actually performing. And because if you don't even know what to fix, then what do you do, right? So I would just add it right away and then have the crash report and try to prioritize what needs to be fixed first.
Nice. So maybe we can take some questions from the internet. Can we get the slides? I think the question there is like, do you feel like sharing those slides on Twitter or something?
Yeah, I'm not really active anymore on Twitter, but yeah.
Alternatively, you can send them to me and I'll share them over Twitter if you're fine with this one, or put them on meetup.com, or so that the community can see them.
I have one of these speaker deck thingy, so I can just put it there and I can share the slide. Yeah, no worries.
Ah, nice. That's great. Also, then, how do you handle the situation where the code being used is dependent on third-party implementation and cannot be changed drastically? How do you approach this one?
Yeah, so you mean like when you use like crappy SDKs and this kind of situation? Yeah, yeah. This is always a hard one. Yeah, you need to do what you need to do, right? So I usually try to have the third-party SDK neatly in his own corner. Try not to spread it over the whole code base, have a layer of abstraction on top of it. So hopefully at some point product take a decision and we can change the provider or we can drop it. So yeah, there's not much to do, but just trying to keep it in its own corner and not spread the third-party SDK through the whole code base, because then it's insane to change. Yeah.
Yep, that makes sense. Any more questions from the audience right now?
I have a question also.
Hey, shoot.
What of in a situation whereby you take over from someone that is dead, and there is no any proper documentation left? Like, some programmers, they used to program a program like a software, but without leaving any proper documentation, or the document file is lost or something like that. Can you think of something like that? I think you start from that.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question. Did anyone understood, or can you rephrase it?
I think he's trying to say that the documentation in general is not available for the code base, right? How would you approach that code base without
Exactly.
like having that documentation to go through and read the code, right?
Yeah.
That is my question exactly.
Okay. Yes, yeah. Well, pull the code and then dive into it, right? So I think it's always a good first a good first thing is to look a bit at the architecture. How, if there is an architecture, first of all, look at what's used under the hood. Is it using some kind of, is it using some API? Is it using a database? Yeah, but if you don't have any documentation, the only thing you can do is really looking at the code, right? Something I would, I didn't talk about this at all, but I tend also to try and time box things, because especially when you end up in a new code base, it's really easy to end up in the rabbit hole, right? It's really easy to start finding something interesting and just digging until you just end up in a level of detail that don't really make sense because you don't really know the code base. So I think it's also, I tend to do this time boxing also things. But yeah, if you don't have any documentation, then it helps if there is modules, then you have a bit of idea what kind of features there in the app. Might be also interesting to start by playing with the app and being like, oh, actually, how does this flow looks like this when I use the app? How does it look like in the code? But yeah, I mean, nowadays, most of the projects I've took on, there was close to no documentation or documentation that was outdated. So usually you really do have to. It's a luxus if there is a good documentation, I would say. Unfortunately.
If I might interject my own opinion there, what I found that actually helps is talking to people. So like in this case, if you still have engineers around from the previous development cycle, you could ask them, but sometimes also, as strange as it sounds, a product owner or a product person might still remember what they did a year ago. So maybe they can give you the right hints on seeing like, hey, what was this thing used for and how you can use it now. I would take more questions from the Slido page right now. So one of them is from Calvin. Thank you for this question. When you join a new team with a large code base, how long are you required to use to learn and get familiar with the code base?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, so I started, for instance, Trade Republic. I started in January, and I still learn quite a bit on the code base. So usually I tend to be quite T-shaped and then try to expand. So I usually start with a topic, and I mean, I usually try to understand most of the code base in a like global kind of state. And then I start to dig into a feature. So at the beginning, I really understood what was going on in the registration process, for instance. And then I understood how the settings were working and all that stuff. And I still have part of the app I have still no clue about, even after we are in March, right? So after 3 months. So I don't think there's really a rule. I think it's important to have a good, okay understanding of most of the app after, I don't know, like it really depends. I don't think there's a rule of time. Of course, if after 3 years you still have no clue about any part of the app, then there's maybe an issue. But I wouldn't stress too much oh fuck, it's been like 2 months and I still don't have a clue about this feature or this feature. It's just more a matter of,
yeah. I also don't think you ever stop learning. Like Like not just on your code base, but also like technology in general always keeps changing. So especially if you're working with more groups together, like you have several teams working together, then there's new things coming in you have to learn and adapt. Cool, then it's time again for somebody in the chat. If you have a question, shoot right now before I read another question from the internet.
Well, more like a comment than a question. So, I mean, lots of times, I mean, at least for me, it was something I had to learn. So lots of times there was no previous developer to talk to, but it turns out if you really make an effort, you will find someone to talk to, especially if you, from the beginning, you make sure that you don't want to blame someone and that you respect other people's time. So if you just come up with a very clear agenda for 60 to 90 minutes and send this out while, so already asking your questions and making sure you're not blaming someone, but you really want to learn and it's going to be an interesting discussion, you will find people.
Nice. Yeah, thanks for this addition. Very important. I'm skipping the unrelated question about tests and Firebase testing. We can probably take a look into this one for the next one. We were talking about the third-party SDKs before, and one of the one question here is, would you prefer writing a wrapper around it? Is this a good approach?
Sorry, what to write a wrapper around?
Yeah, like a third-party dependency that it's not necessarily the best way to interact, not easy to interact with. Sorry, like would you write the wrapper surrounding it? How would you go for it?
Yeah, it's also a case-by-case thing, right? If it's something that is going to be used quite a bit in different places, then yes. If it's like a one-time entry point thing and it's like it needs to be done fast, then maybe not. But usually I would write a wrapper. Like a good example actually has been yesterday or 2 days ago. I had to like code like some kind of file picker because we want to be able to send attachment. And there was already this library in the app that was used quite a bit everywhere. And I just saw that it was pretty old, but I also didn't really had time to find and to find a new one maybe. So I just write a neat wrapper around it and just use the interface, communicate with the interface for this, and with the idea of I might come to this later if we need to use it more, and maybe I will have then more time to actually look if there's better candidates for this. And then it should be just a matter of swapping the implementation.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And then the last one I see on Slido right now is like, how do you justify improvements you suggested to shareholders of the app as a newcomer? I think this is the classic question about trade-offs, right? When do you want to do improvements when you are on the time pressure, and how do you justify it?
Yeah, I think I talk about this a bit during the presentation, but it's usually as a team, we usually try to have a budget for refactoring and improvements. So I think I mentioned in the talk maybe like 20% of the sprints, which is always hard to really because what is 20%? But to have might be also easier to just say, okay, on Fridays or like one Friday of sprints we do refactorings, for instance, and then I think an important point is to try and come up with metrics that it did improve something, that you feel more confident with the code. It's not necessarily a metric, but maybe you improved the test coverage, the crash rate, or for product it's always interesting. But yeah, coming up with metrics that also is not the best.
Yeah, I also liked how you said it in your own talk, that like if you can highlight the advantages, right? So like if you can say like this will improve stability or will improve the code coverage or something, so that you make it easy for the product person to say yes to it, this can help. there was one question in the chat right now. Let me just read it from DDD. We have several applications sharing same code bases. What is the right time to switch to Maven libraries instead of just library modules?
That's a good question. I don't know what's the right time. I guess as everything is, you need to come up with a reason, and why would that be a good idea, and what would that improve? It's probably a fight you have to fight with the management to have the time to do that, I guess.
DDD, does it answer your question, or how do you feel about this one?
Maybe DDD is gone, I don't know.
And that's also fine. Like, I didn't want to call you out like this, just curious. If somebody wants to elaborate, so like this doesn't only go to DDD, but like also if you are in the Zoom right now and have a question, feel free to ask it, because right now I don't see other questions.
I don't see really what's the differences between a Maven library and a library module.
I think this can be the extraction, right? So like that one is hosted on your own Maven central somewhere, your Nexus, and the other one is a Gradle dependency inside your own code base. You know that one is like a real artifact that is published somewhere with a version number, and the other one is just a Gradle module inside. I don't know, guessing.
Yeah, that's also how I understood the question.
I have a certain observation on that because I think this question has been asked in other places also, and I've heard this. The general idea is the library going to be available to a distributed team? It goes into the Maven repository, probably a central, or a Maven central could be one of those, or your own hosted one. But if it is like just one, like you're just sitting across 4 people, you just share it across your projects.
Yeah.
I think Toby's idea is quite good for that as an answer.
Yes, Toby mentioned it in the chat. Florian. I'm just waiting some more minutes if somebody has a question.
I have a question. You mentioned about abstracting libraries out, or abstracting usages of libraries. Would you choose to abstract a library that is extremely ubiquitous or very widespread in such a way that its return types are used everywhere? For example, RxJava will often have observable as a return type, and then that will be cascaded through a lot of different layers of your application. This is the same for live data or flow. Would you choose to keep this dependency on these libraries at every point through the application, or would you try and abstract these behind interfaces or behind your own observable types, perhaps?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think like I've yet to see a code base where they try to abstract RxJava. I think it's more, at this point, it's more a decision of like, I go with this or I don't. And then usually, yeah, then RxJava is supposed to be, yeah, I mean, it's quite widespread, yeah. If you want to switch from, but that's what I meant at some point during my talk. I saw still quite some code base where then they started to mix like RxJava and live data and coroutine, and it was like, yeah, a bit of a mess then at some point. I mean, it's not the same question anymore, but yeah, I don't think I would do it. I think if I choose to go with a library that is that widespread as RxJava usually end up being, then it's just a decision of using this library. I don't think you switch every other 6 months, like kind of. Yeah.
You've not seen our code base. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm just checking all my channels again, seeing if there are any questions appearing on Slido. If you have a question again, feel free. to voice them in the chat, like Toby just did for Ash. But maybe giving it another minute for everybody to think about if they have a question.
Yeah, it's actually a really good point, what Toby's saying. But with Google Map, I see this more as a, because Eric's Java is a mechanism, right? That's something that you feel your app should work with this library all over the place, rather than Google Map is more a feature, except if your entire app is just a map.
Flo, can you read the question for the recording? Not sure if chat is recorded too.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, so it's a response to Ash questions. So to be said, it's a hard decision. I remember I did not do it for Google Maps V1, having the geopoint type being spread all over the app. Then with the V2, I had to refactor everywhere. With types like live data and such, I haven't decided yet. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can add my own opinion on that. So for live data in RxJava, it's kind of like an architectural decision. It's really hard to abstract these because you basically end up with the same interface that the libraries give you. And that's kind of different from a library that gives a specific functionality that you can switch out with another library. Maybe the interface changes a little bit, and then your abstraction is really good and you don't have to change it. But yeah, for architectural libraries, there's really no point in abstracting them. You either go with them or you don't. And like Flo mentioned, if you mix them, you usually end up with a huge mess. So you should think hard about whether you want to use them or not. And if so, maybe limit yourself to just one.
So right now in my company, we are actually having both. Like we're having RxJava and we're having coroutines and like channels and whatnot. And we are trying to move over. But in the meantime, till we have replaced RxJava for reasons, we still have both in place. And I also feel this can be a valid thing happening if everybody agrees, like, okay, this is the thing we are currently having. Yes, we know it's not great, but we are changing it, and over time it will get better.
Yeah, so actually, imagine you have clear guidelines then, like we don't write new code using the old method, and we don't touch old code just for the sake of changing it.
Yeah, we are about to establish them, to be honest.
Okay.
So actually, we have all three, live data, coroutines, and RxJava. But I think we use them in such a way that, you have to understand that each one is a tool appropriate for a different purpose, and you have to use them appropriately. That's not to say that we don't prefer to use coroutines in most cases, and RxJava still makes sense in some cases. And of course, there was a bit of a live data hype a few months ago, and then that sort of reached a bit of a curve. That sort of dropped off now that we have things like Flow and this sort of new type of approaching it. But I've even though we might say for the most part coroutines can replace RxJava, and maybe we don't have to use live data anymore because we can use Flow, I don't think we'll be able to remove live data or RxJava for a very long amount of time. So going back to one of your previous points is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think it's fine to use them in comparison together with each other, especially since JetBrains actually provides the compatibility library to go between and the Android X library to go between live data and coroutines as well. So with these three, it's probably not a great example, but it's an interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, which makes me think about something else that I didn't talk about at all. But for instance, at the moment we have a junior as well at our company, and it's already such a big thing for him to learn about RxJava, because it's a whole way of thinking, and it's a whole it's really if you've never seen this and it's the first time you see this, it's like a huge learning curve. So if you end up having an app where you have not only RxJava, but you also need to learn about coroutines and live data, it's another point, I think. Of course, if you join a team that already knows about it, but it's also something you need to think about, like introducing new tools means that it's probably going to be more time for people to onboard as well.
Mm.
Okay. So I got the feeling that we are closing to the end. Last chance for somebody to speak up. Just this is the end essentially of the meetup for today. I'm happy that I could see you somehow, somewhat. I'm happy that we had like more than 32 people joining over the course, and I'm curious to see how this ends. So one more mention is like tomorrow we will have on our Slack channel on #co-learning, the co-learning remote event happening. This is essentially just more straightforward. If you want to work on your own projects, need some help, have some help to offer, just join there and we figure out how we work together. And then we will meet latest on April the 29th for our next monthly meetup. Up until then, thanks everyone and see you around.
Stay healthy.
Stay healthy. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Have a nice.
Yeah, you too.